Hi, I'm Judith Dreyer. Thank you for joining me for this podcast series, At the Garden's Gate Presents The Holistic Nature of Us. My intent is to take us, you and I, into a better understanding of the concepts behind our holistic nature and how that ties directly to the holistic nature of the world around us. How can we connect the dots in practical ways that we are nature and nature is in us? I will be featuring authors and educators, practitioners, and others whose passion for this earth helps us create bridges. We'll see what's trending, what's relevant to our world today, not just for land use, but to connect the dots between ourselves and nature. It's time for practical action and profound inner change so our natural world is valued once again. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Gail Reynolds. She is the Yukon Master Gardener Coordinator for Middlesex County here in Connecticut. Gail and I met through her radio show, Garden Chat, offered at the ICRV radio here in Deep River, Connecticut. She is a wealth of knowledge on plant systems, including botany, environmental impacts and concerns, as well as a great resource for all of us involved in the Master Gardener program here in Connecticut. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Gail Reynolds here today, and we're going to begin our discussion. Gail, could you tell us about your interest in plant science?
Yeah, well, thanks. First, I'd like to say, Judith, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. But I studied plants both when I was an undergraduate and in graduate school. When I was an undergraduate, I majored in biology. This was in the late 1970s, and I concentrated on plants and ecology and evolutionary biology. But at the time, my university didn't have anything, you did biology and that was it.
Uh-huh.
And I took a class on the recommendation of one of my friends, a fellow biomajor. It's called the Phylogeny of the Vascular Plants. And it was a semester-long class, and I just loved it. It went through all the different plant families as they evolved, starting with, well, of course, it talked about lower plants like mosses and liverworts, and then it moved up to ferns, and then gymnosperms, which are your mostly your conifers, and then your angiosperms, your flowering plants. And of course, moving ahead 40 years, not a lot, but some of the evolutionary paths have changed due to the preponderance now of DNA evidence. But it was I can just say it was magnificent. The professor, who was James Rodman, he just did so much research, and it was just wonderful. It changed my life. And I also studied some wildlife ecology when I was an undergraduate. And then I worked as a chemist for a year, but I came back and I studied terrestrial ecology. It was more outdoors, which is what I really wanted. But learning about New England ecosystems was just to really know what to look for, not just at the plants, but also at the soil, at the inputs and outputs. And you realize what a complex system from the macro level to the very micro level, say the microorganisms in the soil. And I just fell in love with it. And for 2 years I worked on a project called the New England Adirondack National Natural Landmarks Program. You've probably heard of historic landmarks. Well, this was a project also from the Park Service about the national natural landmarks in New England, most of New England except what's the coastal plain, which is Cape Cod and the islands, and then the Adirondacks in New York State, and just looking at the natural systems, both ecologic, geologic, educational, and actually investigating them and ranking them. And it was just, I didn't get paid much, but I got to travel all over New England and just look at magnificent systems. Unfortunately, the book that I and one of my fellow students and one of my professors put together, it's over a 700-page book. I'm sure it's gathering a lot of dust.
Oh, that's too bad.
Park Service closet someplace, but it just, the scale of how things that were affected by human impacts versus the things that really were more natural. It just made such an imprint on me. And that's my background. That's how I got my interest. And I actually worked for many, many years in information technology because that paid the bills. And I learned those skills when I was in graduate school. As I also did a project on, there was a red pine plantation in Patchogue State Forest in Voluntown. And it had, part of it had a controlled burn and the other didn't. And I studied the migration of heavy metals through the stuff and into the mineral soil to see if the burn had any impact on the migration. It turns out it didn't, but that was before there were packages that you could use for statistical analysis. So I had to program it all myself. And, it was a payable skill, but I always, kept my fingers in things by participating in my land trust and my conservation commission and other volunteer opportunities. And now I'm actually being paid, not much, but some, to work in a field I love.
You mean through the Master Gardener program?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Because the focus is on science and on natural communities. Not so much just, oh, here, this is pretty.
Right.
Doesn't matter if it, I have to dump 1 million pounds of fertilizer on it and water it constantly. That's definitely discouraged. Our motto is right plant, right place.
Right.
So I feel very comfortable with the Master Gardener program.
Well, I know you're a great resource, that's for sure. So in view of your background and all the places you studied and the wonderful opportunity to really get in the field, to see how the mountains and the lakes and the streams have all created our topography, number one, but also how it's created ecosystems, number two. So let's look at the idea of sustainability in this framework. What do you feel is the most important issue facing sustainability today?
Well, my thoughts on that so many people have no connection to nature. So they don't know about the natural world. They don't realize all the different relationships among the plants, the microorganisms, the insects, and everything else you find in nature, the weather, the climate, the wildlife, that they don't have that respect. So it doesn't really, when things are changed and developed, they don't have any sense of loss.
Yeah, and if we don't have a sense of loss, then we're not really attached to it, are we?
Yes. That's my thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if people are instructed somewhat, they'll realize, and gardening has become more, sometimes it's a competition almost. Oh, I can grow this, or this is the latest thing, and do you have that? Almost based on my relationships with especially my sisters, what they do, not really knowing that, I put this butterfly bush in, but, and I tell them, well, maybe if you put in a butterfly weed instead, you'd really be helping things out a lot more.
Right, but people put the bush in because that's the perception out there that because it's called a butterfly bush, it's the best thing in the landscape, when actually it's not.
It's not.
But
and in some states, it's even butterfly bush, Buddleia, has even been declared an invasive plant, meaning it overtakes wherever it's planted, and it spreads uncontrollably, and it outcompetes the native plants. And the book that I'd recommend is the Doug Tallamy book.
Yes.
Of course, I'm having a senior moment and I can't remember the name of it, but
Bringing Nature Home.
Nature Home. That's right.
Yes.
He really shows how, planting things that may be pretty, don't necessarily provide the habitat for insects and other pollinators. And that insects are actually good things. They're not things to just be squashed and vacuumed up.
Well, I went to a talk several years ago on the bees and the insects, and I came away with a different awareness. Out of the insect population, I think only 1 out of 10 is actually a pest or something to be managed differently.
Right.
But most of them are actually quite beneficial. And again, we don't quite have that awareness because our society wants to keep pushing the pesticides and the, et cetera, in our landscape.
Yeah, both that, and I find that having a squeaky clean suburban or urban upbringing just doesn't introduce people to the beneficial aspects of insects in what they actually do.
You're right. It doesn't. And we can see many examples of that in some of our more planned communities. You drive around and you see a lot of Asian influences, and it's not that the plants from Asia are bad. It's just we have not adapted to them, so therefore we're not providing food for many of our insect populations or nectar for the pollinators.
That's right. And, it's an education thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, we just have to keep repeating what we think is important and keep repeating it, and eventually some of it will stick.
Well, my Native American ancestors would say it takes 7 generations. So we have to keep at it, as you said. Well, this leads us into one of my focuses, and that is a partnership with nature. And for me, it means being respectful, having even a sense of reverence for nature, for the intelligent management and I don't know the right word, but it's an intelligent operating system. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think in what first drove this home for me is when I was in graduate school and we went to the Branford supply ponds, which are in Branford, and there were two incidents. The first one that really made a big impression on me was that on an abutting parcel, a little subdivision, homes had been put in, but they didn't really realize the power of water, or that they were built on the erodible soils, the reddish soils from the Connecticut Valley Arcos, and within a year or two of the homes being put in, they had just put like culverts that just dumped the water into the woods, which of course was the Branford supply ponds, which is a natural area, and the force of the water created an erosion gully that was over my head. I'm not that tall. I'm 5'3", but still, that really reinforces the power of water, a natural force that people think can just be ignored or controlled. And I think that a natural force such as that, and others that maybe aren't as evident, should be respected. And the second item I wanted to point out from that same trip there was one of my professors was doing some plots measuring forest floor material, and then the Boy Scouts came in, and to do their good deed, they raked up all the forest floor material, which really screwed up the forest relationships, because if you want natural regeneration of plants, they require the information, the leaves that fall, the dead wood that decomposes, and all of the insects they're in, and the microbes, that has to stay there. And it gives you thought, makes you think, well, why did they think that this is a natural area? Why did they think that needed to be raked up?
Well, that's an interesting question, because that gets us into maybe a statement about our own development. You know, maybe,
Right.
maybe we're not as developed as a species as we think we are and we've lost our connection so much with nature that we don't even pay attention to the consequences of what we're doing. We want everything to look nice, which is fine. We can co-create a beautiful forest with nature, but there has to be some understanding of the relationship of all the parts to the whole, which gets us back to holism, gets us back to our holistic nature. The holistic nature of nature requires all these components to be there, as you just beautifully demonstrated, to keep the forest going.
Right. And I think that's such a great point. And I think that because there's so much development and sprawl, that a lot of times backyards really are the natural ecosystem, although they're mostly not natural. That's where nature has to live. And I think people, instead of trying to control everything, should just let nature do its thing, and they will be pleasantly surprised.
Yes, and with very little management.
Right.
Be very surprised. I took a backyard, it's very typical suburban meadow, about a third of an acre, and I just let it grow wild. And all I did was I did use the lawnmower, but I only put a couple of paths in. And the amount of wildlife that came in and other species of plants that came in was amazing. And I have to tell you, my neighbors loved it. They didn't do it, but they loved what I did. And so did the kids. They were fascinated by it because nobody else had a backyard like this. And it was a sanctuary. I asked them not to kill a spider because it was in their way, or not to kill a bee because it landed on them. Just be quiet and the bee will move on. And eventually they did respect that. But I think we've lost the understanding of the diversity that we have in our landscape.
That's true. And unfortunately, a meadow growth like that, because I have one as well that I love.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some cases there are like even homeowners association agreements that forbid those.
Yes.
Or when people do things like that, they are, if the place has a blight ordinance, people are considered to be creating blight, which is so far from the truth. But again, it's an education. I know recently Maggie Redfern, who's I think she's the assistant director at the Connecticut College Arboretum, a wonderful place. She lives right in New London, and let her, on her small urban plot, let it go back to nature. And she was written up for a blight ordinance, but she did go in and explain to the powers that be, and they understood and, said, oh, okay, we're educated. I don't think that they have removed the blight ordinance, but at least, they were educated.
Yeah, and it's going to take us one garden at a time in some respects to make those changes. I know I've seen on the internet front yard gardens, I think it was in Canada, and they really had to work very diligently to get it through. And the gardens were actually quite lovely. They weren't they weren't messy, and they had vegetables included in there, and using up their land space to provide food, but it was organic. Mm-hmm. So you're right. It is all about education. I'm curious, Gail, you've been out in the wild lots of times, and you've had a chance to see so many different native plants and native landscapes. What is your favorite?
Well, I collectively love native orchids, and I don't know why. There's just something about them. They're so delicate, and there's such a range of them. There are the more common ones like lady slippers. The pink lady slipper is fairly common. It has the beautiful pink flower and the really graceful leaves. And then there's also rattlesnake plantain is an orchid. You might be familiar with it if you've been in the woods. It has green and white leaves, which is unusual to have a native variegated plant, but it is. And in late July, early August, it puts up spikes of bells. And orchids are also they're one of the most like highly evolved plant families. But then there are other orchids that aren't as common, and those tend to grow in bogs. And bogs are just, there's just nothing like a bog. Have you ever been in a bog?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I have the wonderful pleasure up in Vermont, where my herb teacher lives.
Yeah.
She discovered in a marshy, boggy area, I'm going to use the word boggy area, lady slippers. And Gail, there had to be 400 of them.
Right.
It was one of the beautiful places to see.
Yeah. And there are also yellow lady slippers, and they're white lady slippers. They're different species, but there are also, there's some bogs around here in Connecticut, and not all the places are preserved, but you'll find things like rose pogonia, which is just such a delicate plant. It has like a lip that goes forward with, like, it's pink, and it has little pink, like it's different shades of pink and little dots, and there's a little yellow in there, and then this fringed lip. Sorry, my dog just knocked something over. And it's just dainty. And then there's grass pink, which is
grass what?
Pink.
Okay.
It's really more purple, but it's just a lovely plant, and it's very uncommon. It's not rare, but it's certainly not common. And then there are also other kinds of orchids called orchises, and I haven't seen. Well, there's some. Actually, I have seen some in Connecticut, and the spots where they are really not given away. But we own property up in northern Vermont, and there's a purple fringed orchis. It's the most delicate, like these little tiny flowers with a fringed lip, and they're light purple. And then there's a white fringed orchis, and then there are others that that don't have a fringe. Plants are just so striking that if you've seen them, the whole bog environment is just, you have plants in there that are just uncommon. Like, that's where you'll find cranberries growing natively. You'll find bladderworts, and you'll find that's where you find the insectivorous plants, bladderworts, sundews, and pitcher plants, which are just amazingly adapted. And their flowers, they actually have flowers, and you can see where the insects get trapped. There are just all sorts of, like, you have your swamp milkweed, your Asclepias incarnata will grow there. If you have a peat bog, sometimes what you'll have is water with a mat of peat on top that you can actually walk across, but it's like walking. Remember the old water beds?
Yeah.
How they used to ripple?
Yeah.
It's like walking on a water bed.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So that's I love orchids.
I can tell. You certainly gave us a few species that we can possibly look up ourselves. I know I tend to walk, I live near a lot of marshland, so I'm going to keep my eyes open for some of these species. But before we conclude,
Sure.
I would like you to give our listeners today some practical tips, 1 to 3, and give us something practical to do, something they can take home and maybe even think about. In New England here, we're in winter, so it's a good time to look at catalogs. It's a good time to think about our gardens for next year. What would you like them to go home with today?
That's such a great point. And, my first point is to look at what's growing in natural areas near you. And you know that those plants are adapted to your area. And it's not like these plants are not beautiful. Like, there are all sorts of dogwoods. And I was just thinking today, because we got a few inches of snow. You probably did too today, right? Did you get a few inches?
We did.
We got some snow. It's lovely, nice powdery snow. And I was looking at my red twig dogwood, which is a nice native plant. the dogwoods have been changed. It's known as Cornus sericea, although dogwoods have been moved to another genus, but Cornus sericea works. And the twigs are red, and it just looks so beautiful against the snow. And then Ilex verticillata, which is winterberry holly. It's a deciduous holly that's very common here, and it's very nondescript in this summer. The flowers are little tiny things that you don't even notice, but now it has beautiful red berries. And I know that that's quite a contrast during the snow. And
Gail,
it's not. Yes.
Just repeat that name again. I always tell my readers that
Yes.
knowing the common name is good, but knowing the botanical name is great. And
Right.
so that berry is Ilex
verticillata.
Okay.
verticillata, I believe it is.
Okay.
And winterberry holly.
Mhm.
And it's not the first thing that the birds will eat, but I know there have been times when we've had like a few feet of snow, and my shrub is just like the berries are just on top of the snow, and then I've seen bluebirds come and eat them, and it's just, it's great to know that you're helping such a lovely bird like a bluebird when the conditions for them aren't that easy because
Right.
there's so much snow around, and that's a food source for them. So you can think of winter interest, but then you can also think like there are so many plants, especially I'm thinking of shrubs that are just really gorgeous. There's pinkster flower. It's called azalea, but it's really rhododendron. That's one of the first plants to flower in the spring. It flowers before mountain laurel. And if you just looked at it, you might think it's mountain laurel, but the flower is really a rhododendron flower where it's lipped and it has these huge stamens, and it's quite pretty, and it grows along forest edges.
Mhm.
And then, of course, there's mountain laurel, our state flower. There are spice bush, which is another lovely shrub. That's one of the first It's one of the first shrubs to flower, usually like end of April. It has little yellow flowers. The leaves have a lovely smell. Also, not really, it's more of a tree, but early in the season there's shad bush or shad blow or June blow. Has a lot of names: Juneberry, serviceberry. There are a lot of them. They're hard to tell apart, but the genus is Amelanchier, Amalanchier, and those flower before everything else. Nice white flowers. If you didn't know what they were, you might just think they were black cherries, but they're not. And those are lovely, and they produce red berries.
That's great.
Then like if you get also like in August when it's really hot and dry, then you should plant Clethra ulnifolia. It's called sweet pepper bush or summer sweet, because that grows. That flowers in August. What
Just
more
like
could
the
you
roses.
ask for?
Yeah. Summer
Yeah.
sweet, so it flowers in August. Yeah, we're always
Yes.
looking to keep a continuous color, aren't we, in our landscape?
A lot of people like flowers, the flowering, the actual flower of the plant. So if you'd like that, that's one way to do it. There are native plants that flower, up until witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana. That flowers October into November. It has these
Right.
weird yellow flowers. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. Okay, so what's point number 2?
Point number 2 is don't over-fertilize. Really have your soil tested before you don't necessarily have to dump things in your soil, because what happens is that you can put, you can listen to the commercials and put lots of fertilizer. And what the nitrogen fertilizer really does is it promotes vegetative growth, green growth, and it just can't be all used when it's dumped in such copious amounts all at one time. So when it rains or when you water, it gets washed away and it ends up in the water supply, the groundwater supply and the surface water supply, and it's not good for those aquatic ecosystems. It really puts them out of balance.
Right. And I know for myself as a master gardener, I try to encourage people to get their soil tested and not to over-fertilize. And isn't there kind of a saying in the program, less is more?
Yes. And actually you can, if you leave your grass clippings in place, that's really all the nitrogen you need, if you grow grass. It really is.
Mm-hmm.
If you have like one of those mowers that shreds them up, or if you just leave them there. And then also, the same thing about lime. You don't necessarily need to add that. In fact, some plants don't like lime, raises the pH, and some plants like blueberries and rhododendrons, they don't like high pH, and they won't grow in it. It causes the nutrients they need to not be available to them.
Mm-hmm. Those are really good reminders. Okay, what's number 3?
So, and the third thing, this is a little bit more arcane, but I think that people should realize that the plants, the ecosystems we have around here really evolved since the last ice age, which has been like such a long time ago. It's not like it was last year or 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. It was really long, long, long ago. So if you think about that passage of time and how long it took for those things to just get to a point where they're living in harmony, shall we say. Although it's not like a tight, rigid type equilibrium. It's something like things are always changing, mm-hmm. but on a really slow pace. And I think that just that acknowledgement of time and not to expect things to happen overnight or changes that we make overnight can have drastic adverse impacts on our natural ecosystems.
Well, Gail, I think that's the whole point of what I'm trying to get across to our listeners and into the world is that we want everything yesterday. We have to work 24/7 in order to get something now. Yet nature tells a different story.
Right.
Nature tells us that things are changing, but we have to pay attention to how and when they do change. A goldenrod is going to change differently from a rose, but yet they live in harmony as neighbors. And
that's right.
So I really like that you stress that point here for our listeners. I think that's wonderful because that's what I'm trying to get across too.
Right. And, just like short-term gratification, I know like a lot of the self-help books say like, forego that. And I'm just saying, give it a rest for ecological reasons.
Right. Right. I know that our time is ending here, and I'm really, really grateful and delighted that you could share some of your wisdom. I'd love to have you come back. We'll pick another topic. But I know that you're very involved with the Master Gardener program. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with for yourself or for the program?
Well, I would love to say a little bit about the Master Gardener program. It's a science-based program that it has a classroom that is, I think, 16 weeks long, and then projects after that. And you're really helping the public spread the word about good gardening practices that are based on science. And, once people take it, they're usually addicted for the rest of their lives. And we also have advanced Master Gardener classes. Judith, you've taught some of those, where we give our students and the public, because anybody can take the advanced Master Gardener classes, insight into other topics. And our website is mastergardener.uconn.edu. And please check it out. And when you're looking through your catalogs while we have snow on the ground, you should keep an eye open for native plants and native plant sales. And I think that, when you start to to stock up for the spring. You know, just think about what we talked about today, about the fertilizer, about the native plants.
That's great. The other thing I want to mention about the Master Gardener program, because some of our listeners may not be from Connecticut, but it's a nationwide program offered by the state universities. So I highly recommend that our listeners who are interested in learning more, and believe me, people have a variety of interests. I can only tell you from my own experience, I've met some really terrific people who are passionate about their particular interest in gardening, whether it's becoming a member of the Iris Society or the Butterfly Society or growing vegetables. There's such a variety of ways to meet people and to become more informed through the Master Gardener program.
That's absolutely right. And also to educate people, educate the public.
Yes, exactly.
You never have enough of that.
Well, Gail, what I'm going to say is thank you so much for joining us. I hope my listeners feel as inspired as I do by you, your talk, your expertise, and your very practical advice.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, my delight, definitely. So what I want to say is I'm going to conclude this podcast by reminding all of you that I'm the author of At the Garden's Gate book and blog. My book, At the Garden's Gate, is available through my website. Go to judithdryer.com, or you can find it on Amazon, Nook, Kobe, Indigo, as well as Ingram distribution. You can visit my website for a replay of this podcast, and it will be on other platforms. So thank you again, everyone. Have a good day.